21-1 work together. Now notice these work together on their own. These are big points, 33 points for each of those. They're big problems. Okay, so we have 5 steps. Our first step, it says that we're going to journalize the adjusting entries for accrued interest income and accrued interest expense on December 31st. We're going to use page 14 of the general journal. So here they show us an unadjusted trial balance. They give us our question information and then our chart of accounts. We need to look at our question information to help us figure out what our adjusting entries are going to be for interest income and interest expense. Okay, so first thing, we're going to look at our note receivable. And our note receivable, notice it says that we're going to record these adjusting entries on December 31st. It's the end of the fiscal period. Okay. And when we're recording our, for a note receivable, we're going to have interest receivable. And then we're also going to have interest income. Okay. We don't have a source document because it is an adjusting entry. So now what we need to do is we need to figure out, okay, how much are we going to debit and credit? We're first going to look at the principal amount, which is $10,000. Then we have a rate of 6%, and it's a 100-day or 120-day note. We don't have it for 120 days yet because notice we signed it on November 16th. So here's where we need to compute how many days we've actually had that note. There's 30 days in November, so I'm going to take 30 minus 16. That's 14 days of November. I'm going to use all 31 days of December because we're recording this on December 31st. So I'm going to take 14 days of November plus 31 days of December to get 45 days. So now I'm going to take 10,000 times that 6% times 45 over 360. That's going to give me $75 of interest. Okay, my next one is I need to record my accrued interest expense. So I'm going to just put in the date, the 31st. When we're doing interest expense now, I'm going to have a debit to interest expense, and I'm going to have a credit to interest payable. Okay, again, I don't have a source document because it's an adjusting entry, and I need to then figure out what my number is. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to figure out how long did I have that note payable. We signed it on the 1st. There's 31 days in December, so I'm going to take 31 minus 1, and that's 30 days then. So 12,000 for the principal times the 6% times 30 over 360. That's going to give us $60 for our interest expense and interest payable. Okay, that's all we needed to do for step 1. So I'll grade step 1. Moving on to step 2. Now we're going to journalize the closing entry for interest income and then journalize the closing entry for interest expense using page 14 of the general journal. So they already have it labeled for us again as our closing entries. Okay, and what we're going to use here is our partial unadjusted trial balance. We're specifically going to be looking at our interest income and our interest expense. Notice here we had a credit to interest income, and then we also had a debit to interest expense. Okay. Let's start with my date. I can just put in 31. In this case, I'm going to debit my interest income, and I'm going to credit income summary. Okay, so I need to figure out how much. So my interest income, here I have a credit balance of $3,090, sorry. And remember down here, I did a debit of 75 or a credit of $75. So plus 75 That means I have a credit balance of $3,165. I'm closing interest income. So to close interest income, I would need to debit it for $3,165. And I'm going to credit income summary for the same amount, $3,165. Okay, my next transaction, put in the date again. Now I need to close my interest expense. So when I look at my interest expense, I have a debit balance of $1,315. And my adjusting entry, I have a $60 debit. So I'm going to add to that my $60 debit. If I have a debit balance, that means I need to credit interest expense to close it. So if I credit interest expense, I'm going to debit income summary. So I'm going to debit for the amount that I figured out, $1,375. And like I said, to close interest expense, I need to credit for $1,375. Grade step 2. Next step. We are going to journalize the January 1st